the candle flame gutters low. A quill hovers, trembling, above ink black words. 23 names. Children no older than 9. Skin like fresh cream, hair spun gold, eyes the color of summer sky. Beautiful. Angelic. And in the margin, in cold, deliberate strokes, property. These were not the children of masters. They were made, crafted through hidden sin, raised in shadows, sold for fortunes. One woman saw. One woman wrote their names in secret. And once she began, heaven itself seemed to hold its breath. The rain came down in sheets that night in Richmond, the kind of rain that sounded like judgment tapping on tin roofs and windowpanes. Georgia Hayes sat alone in her narrow rented room on the edge of the free black district, the single candle throwing long, uneasy shadows across the walls. The air smelled of wet brick, old wood, and the faint metallic bite of ink. Before her lay the ledger she had just finished copying, Hanover County Estate Inventory, Cornelius Draper, deceased. The parchment was still damp at the edges from her careful blotting. She had copied records for 12 years. Births, deaths, transfers, valuations. She had taught herself to let the words slide past her eyes without lodging in her heart. A man listed as sound in wind and limb, $1,200. A woman, good breeder, healthy issue expected, $950. A child, stout boy, likely field hand, $400. Numbers. Descriptions. Nothing more. Until tonight. Her eyes returned to the section on minors. 23 children, all under 10. The scribe's hand had lingered over each one, as though the ink itself were reluctant to commit them to the page. Female, age 7. Hair flaxen, eyes clearest blue, complexion fair as cream. No visible mark of color. Value, $820. Male, age 6. Features delicate, skin without blemish, hair golden when struck by light. Value, $900. Female, age 9. Countenance angelic, skin pale as porcelain, bearing gentle and refined. Value, $1,050. The valuations climbed higher than any field hand her age could ever command. These were toddlers, infants, some of them, too small to pick cotton, too young to scrub floors. Yet someone had priced them like rare porcelain, like paintings by a European master. And beside each name, stamped in thick black letters that seemed to press deeper into the paper than the rest, property. Georgia's hand had frozen mid-stroke when she first read them. The quill trembled, a single drop of ink falling like a tear onto the page. She blotted it quickly, but the stain remained a small, dark accusation. She had seen light-skinned children before. The system made certain of that. White men took what they wanted, the law looked the other way, the children came out carrying their mother's bondage and their father's features. Most were absorbed into the quarters, worked until they broke, sold when they were no longer useful. But these were different. These were curated. Displayed. Priced not for labor, but for appearance. For desire. She closed the ledger. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. She could hear her own heartbeat, steady but loud, like a drum in a church before the sermon begins. 2 days later she delivered the copy to the Hanover clerk. He was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that never quite met hers. She laid the papers down, waited until he had glanced over them, then asked, casual, almost idle, "Those children in Draper's inventory, the values seem high for little ones." He didn't look up. Draper dealt in fancy stock. Always did. Premiums are normal. Fancy stock. The words landed like stones in still water. She had heard them whispered in the kitchens of rich houses, hissed between women who knew too much. Fancy stock meant light skin. Soft hair. Features that could pass in certain rooms, certain beds. It meant girls sold young to men who wanted beauty without the inconvenience of courtship. It meant children raised to be ornaments, living dolls in parlors where no one asked questions. But 23. All under 10. All described with the same loving precision one might use for a thoroughbred colt. That evening she bought a new notebook, plain, brown, unremarkable, from a free black stationer who asked no questions. She paid with coins she had saved for a new pair of shoes. She lit a fresh candle, opened the notebook, and began to copy again. Not for money. For memory. For witness. Each name. Each description. Each price. She wrote slowly, letting the weight of every letter settle into the paper. When she finished, she stared at the list. 23 souls, reduced to lines of ink. 23 children who had never known freedom, who might never know it, who had been designed to look like the very people who owned them. She closed the book. She prayed brief, wordless, the kind of prayer that rises when words fail. Lord, if these are yours, why do they bear chains? If this is man's doing, when will you answer? 2 weeks later, another county. Chesterfield. Another dead planter, thrown from a horse, neck broken clean. Another inventory. 5 more children. Ages 4 to 9. Complexions nearly white, hair spun gold, eyes blue as summer sky. Values soaring past reason. Property. Again. Her pulse quickened as she copied. Not fear, not yet. Recognition. Pattern. Back in her room, she added them to the notebook. She began a second page, a map. Counties in careful lines: Hanover, Chesterfield, Henrico, Goochland, Prince George, Dinwiddie, Powhatan. Names of the dead: Draper, Fairchild, Harrison, Talbot, Winchester, Bryant, Saunders. Dates of death. Executors. Connections. For had belonged to the Virginia Agricultural Society men who gathered quarterly to discuss soil, seed, and stock improvement. 3 had sat together in the state legislature. 2 were bound by marriage, sisters married to cousins. Small world, yes. But too small. Too deliberate. She thought of her father, Marcus Hayes. He had bought his freedom in 1798 after 23 years of saving. Then his wife. Then his children. 1 coin at a time. 1 season at a time. He had taught her the scripture he clung to: "The Lord is my rock, and my fortress, and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust." He taught her caution. Keep your head down, daughter. Do your work. Be valuable, but never indispensable. Indispensable people become targets. He died when she was 17. Pneumonia took him in 3 days. She had followed his counsel ever since. Quiet. Precise. Invisible. Until now. The notebook felt heavier each night. By the end of 1849, 42 names. By spring 1850, 97. Children aged 3 to 11. All light. All valuable. All appearing in estates where the master had died suddenly: accidents, fevers, falls from horses. Sudden. Convenient. She expanded her work. Letters to clerks in Petersburg, Suffolk, Lynchburg, Farmville. Lower rates. Faster service. Discretion guaranteed. She traveled by stagecoach when she could, by foot when she couldn't. Always polite. Always careful. Always watching. In every courthouse, the same hunt: estate inventories, probate records, bills of sale. And there they were. More names. More descriptions that read like love letters written in blood. More prices that mocked reason. She knew now, this was no accident of lust. This was arrangement. A network. A program. But how? Who? Why only after death? Why sell so quickly? She needed someone who had lived inside the great houses. Someone who had seen the private rooms, the locked wings, the children kept apart. It took 2 months to find courage enough to speak to Grace. Grace was 32, sharp-eyed, owned by Malcolm Preston, a Richmond merchant who liked to call himself enlightened. He let his people hire their time on Sundays. He thought it made him modern. In truth, it only lengthened their chains. Georgia watched Grace at the market for weeks. Noted the way she moved, never hurried, always calculating. One May morning, the air thick with river smell and fish scales, Georgia positioned herself near the fish stalls. When Grace approached, Georgia spoke so low the words almost drowned in the crowd. "I need to know about the children. The light ones. The ones sold south." Grace's hand paused over a mackerel. Then moved on. Face blank. "Why?" "Because I'm finding too many. In records. Estates linked together. Someone has to know." Grace paid for her fish. Moved to the next stall. Georgia followed, careful distance. After 3 more purchases, Grace spoke to the wrong person, if someone saw them, if the notebook were found. Sunday came. She sat through service at First African Baptist, her usual place, then walked to Second. The basement smelled of damp stone and candle wax. A few lingered after service, talking quietly. Georgia took a corner chair, hands folded, head bowed. Grace arrived with 2 others. Phyllis, 25, sharp cheekbones, watchful. Sarah, 50, gray at the temples, dignity carved deep. They sat close. Voices whispers. "Grace, you said 97. Georgia nodded. Ages 3 to 11. All light. All in estates of men who died sudden. All sold south through the same dealers. Sarah exhaled slowly. "It's older than you think. 20 years. More. They don't speak its name. But the quarters know." Phyllis leaned in. "If a woman comes out light, if her children come out too light, you pray they never notice you." George's voice was steady. "Notice for what?" Sarah's eyes were old, tired, angry. "They choose. The ones with the right look. European look. They move them. Better cabins. Better food. No field work. And then." She paused. The silence stretched. "They use them. Deliberate. To make children who look white." The words landed like stones on George's chest. She had suspected. But hearing it plain was different. Like a wound opening. Phyllis continued. "The children don't stay with the rest. Special quarters. Away. Raised separate. Taught manners. Sometimes reading. They're groomed. Like livestock for show." Georgia felt cold settle deep. "And when the master dies?" "Sarah, the estate sells quick. Before questions come. Before kin ask too much. Before the children grow old enough to remember names." Georgia looked at the 3 women. Their faces held no surprise, only the long knowledge of survival. She thought of the notebook. Of the names. Of the scripture her father loved, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." But vengeance had not yet come. She spoke softly. "I have their names. I have the connections. I need to know the rest." Grace studied her. "You sure you want the rest?" Georgia met her eyes. "I already carry 97. What's a few more?" Sarah nodded once. "Then listen close. Because once you know, you can't unknow." The candle flickered. The rain had stopped outside. But inside Georgia, something had begun to storm. The basement air was thick with the scent of old hymnals and damp stone. The 4 women sat in a tight circle, knees almost touching, voices pitched so low they seemed to sink into the floorboards. Georgia felt the weight of every word Sarah had just spoken settle into her bones like lead. Breeding. Deliberate. Systematic. The word echoed in her mind like a door slamming shut on hope. Phyllis leaned forward, her voice sharp with bitterness. "They feed them better than the rest of us. White bread, milk, eggs. Teach them to speak without the rhythm of the quarters. No ain't, no yonder. They train them to curtsy, to pour tea, to move like they belong in parlors. And when they reach 4 or 5 old enough to survive the wagons, young enough to forget their mothers, they're gone." George's question came quiet,
but it carried the dread she had carried for months.
And when the planter dies?
Grace's eyes met hers, unflinching.
The children are sold. Fast. Within weeks of probate. There are dealers who wait for it. They call it the fancy trade.
The children go south, New Orleans, Charleston, Mobile.
Sold as house servants.
She paused, lips curling.
But that's not what they're bought for. How do the dealers know? Georgia asked, though the answer was already forming in the pit of her stomach. Advance arrangements, Sarah said.
The planters work with specific men. When a child reaches the right age, they're listed in the estate with special marks. The dealers watch the courthouses.
When probate opens, they send buyers. Cash ready. No questions. Georgia thought of the notations she had seen in margins, faint but deliberate. Per agreement. LS.
She spoke the letters aloud.
LS. Does that mean anything? All three women stiffened. Sarah's face drained of color.
The word came out like a curse whispered in church.
Lauren Savard. New Orleans. He's the center. Connections from Virginia to Maryland, down to the Gulf. If you've seen those initials, you're touching the heart of it. Georgia drew the notebook from her apron pocket.
Her hands trembled only slightly as she opened it.
Tell me everything. Names. Plantations. How it works. All of it.
What followed was an hour of quiet horror. The women spoke in turns, voices low, eyes distant, as though reciting a litany they had long wished to forget. The network had begun in the early 1830s. A handful of planters, Draper, Fairchild, Harrison, Talbert, Winchester, Bryant, Saunders, and at least 4 more, had formed an unspoken compact. They selected women from their quarters who carried the lightest skin, the straightest hair, the features closest to Europe. These women were moved to separate cabins, far from the fields.
Better food. Lighter work. No whippings. No overseers. But no choice.
They used them like brood mares, Phyllis said, the words bitter as gall.
Improving the stock, they call it. Premium merchandise.
The children born from these unions were taken at birth or shortly after.
Raised apart.
No contact with the other enslaved. They ate from the big house table scraps. They learned letters enough to read simple instructions. They learned to walk with straight backs, to speak with clipped precision. They were groomed for display.
They're never sold before 4, Sarah continued. Too young to survive the journey. Rarely after 12.
By then, the blood shows in other ways, curls tightening, skin darkening under sun. Or they start asking questions.
The sweet spot is 5 to 10. Useful. Moldable. Innocent enough to be shaped.
When a planter died, often suddenly, the children appeared in the inventory with loving detail.
Hair like spun gold. Eyes blue as the heavens. Complexion without blemish. And the notations, LS. Per prior agreement. Within days, Savard's agents arrived at the auction block. They bid high. They took what they came for. Where do they go? Georgia asked, voice steady despite the cold spreading through her. Everywhere, Sarah said.
Rich men in New Orleans buy them for their households.
Some become companions. Some become worse.
Others go to Charleston families who want servants who look like status.
I've heard whispers of Cuba. Brazil. Once they're south, they vanish. No letters. No word. Nothing. Do the mothers know? Georgia whispered.
Grace's laugh was a dry, broken thing.
They know. That's the cruelty of it.
They raise them knowing that one day, around 4 or 5, a wagon will come. They watch their children loaded up.
They watch the dust settle on the road. And they keep working.
Because if they scream, if they fight, they lose the others. Or they lose themselves.
Georgia sat silent, the notebook open on her lap. 97 names stared back at her. 97 children. 97 futures stolen before they could begin.
Why has no one spoken? She asked finally.
Phyllis looked at her with something close to pity. Spoken to who?
The law sees property, not people.
Owners can breed stock as they please. Sell as they please.
The whites who know either profit or pretend blindness. The rest of the world prefers the lie that slavery is only fields and whips, not nurseries built for sale. Sarah reached out, laid a hand on George's.
Be careful. These men sit in legislatures. They own judges.
They shake hands with sheriffs.
If they learn someone is writing down their sins. Georgia nodded. I'll be careful. But careful was no longer enough.
Over the months that followed, she became a ghost in the courthouses. She traveled farther, Amelia, Nottoway, Lunenburg, offering her services at rates no one could refuse. She pored over records from the 1830s, the 1840s. She learned the code words: fancy girl, premium child, refined features, superior complexion. They were not descriptions.
They were signals. She found Lauren Savard's name again and again. Bills of sale. Transport manifests. Letters between executors and New Orleans. Standing orders. Purchase all LS. Marked minors upon probate. No limit on price.
By the end of 1850, her notebook held 137 names. She had traced the program back to 1833, 17 years of deliberate sin.
12 planters confirmed. 6 more suspected. All bound by more than business. Agricultural societies. Masonic lodges. Marriages between cousins.
Wills witnessed by brothers in secret. This was not commerce.
This was covenant. She kept 2 books now.
The working ledger, messy, urgent, hidden in the false bottom of her sewing basket. The clean copy, neat, annotated, connections drawn in careful lines, she sent north to a free black family in Philadelphia. She told them only that it was genealogy research.
Asked them to seal it. To open it only if she vanished.
In January 1851, she began to test the water.
Quiet questions to clerks she had known for years. I noticed high values in the Draper children. Clerical error? The Fairchild sales to New Orleans unusually fast. Standard?
Most brushed her off.
Market conditions. Nothing unusual.
But in Powhatan County, a young clerk named Daniel Foster paused.
He looked at her with new eyes.
You're observant, Miss Hayes.
It's my job, she said. He glanced at the empty office. Lowered his voice. There are arrangements. I'm not supposed to know. But you see things when you handle enough papers. Certain planters. Certain children. Certain dealers. The sales are planned before death. Instructions in wills. Contact Savard immediately upon my passing. Sell LS children within 30 days. It's legal. So no one questions. Others know? Some. But it's uncomfortable. Easier to process the pages and not think about the children behind them. Georgia thanked him.
Walked home under a sky heavy with winter stars. She felt the net tightening. In March 1851, she arrived at the Henrico courthouse for her regular work.
The chief clerk, William Graves, waited. Miss Hayes. A special job. Private estate papers. Family wants copies. Not through regular clerks. Off the record. She followed him to a back room. A folder waited. Robert Harrison, deceased. Standard inventory.
Then the children, 8 of them, 6 matching the pattern.
And beneath, letters. Correspondence with Lauren Savard. 5 years of it.
Words leaped from the page like accusations. The last shipment fetched excellent prices in New Orleans.
3 exceeded $1,000. We should aim for 6 to 8 premium children annually across the participating estates. With proper selection and management, the program will continue to yield superior results.
Merchandise of the highest grade.
Georgia's hands went cold. She copied every line, every word.
When she finished, she delivered the work to Graves,
collected her pay, walked out into the March wind. A week later, a knock at 9 o'clock.
Graves stood on her threshold, face pale, eyes urgent.
Miss Hayes. We must speak. She let him in.
He glanced around the small room, closed the door.
I gave you those Harrison papers deliberately. I needed to see if you would notice, if you would react, or if you would simply copy and forget. Georgia met his eyes. I noticed. I thought you might. He exhaled. I've watched you for years. Quiet. Precise. Never a question out of place. But lately, you ask.
You look longer at certain pages.
I've seen the pattern too. I've seen the letters. I've seen the names.
And I've seen men like Savard walk into probate courts with cash and instructions written years before a man dies.
He leaned closer. I'm not part of it. But I've processed their papers. I've stamped their sales. And I can't unsee it. If you're gathering this, if you're writing it down, you're not alone. But you're in danger. They protect their own.
Georgia felt the storm inside her shift.
Not fear. Resolve.
Then help me, she said.
Help me prove it. Help me make sure it's not forgotten.
Graves looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once.
I will.
But know this, once we begin, there is no going back.
The Lord may forgive. Men like them never do. Outside, the night was still.
But inside Georgia Hayes, something unbreakable had begun to form.
A witness. A record.
A cry against the darkness.
Georgia stood motionless in the doorway of William Graves' ruined office.
Papers lay like fallen leaves after a storm, scattered, torn, trampled.
Drawers gaped open.
The air smelled of spilled ink and panic. The candle on the desk still burned, wick low, flame trembling as though it knew what had happened here. She had come for the copy of the ledger Graves promised. Instead, she found silence where a man should have been.
Miss Hayes.
The voice came from behind it, calm, measured, the voice of authority that never needs to shout. She turned slowly.
Sheriff Coleman filled the hallway, broad shoulders blocking the lamplight.
2 deputies flanked him, hands resting near their belts.
I need you to come with me.
They took her down narrow stairs to a windowless room in the courthouse basement. No bars, but the door locked behind her.
A single chair.
A table scarred by years of interrogations.
Coleman sat across from her. The deputies stood like sentinels.
William Graves is dead, he said without ceremony.
Body found in the river this morning. Coroner says he slipped on the muddy bank. Drowned. Tragic accident.
Georgia felt the floor tilt beneath her. The room smelled of mildew and old fear.
Accident?
Her voice was steady.
Too steady. That's the finding. No marks. No witnesses.
Just a man who walked too close to the water after dark.
Coleman leaned forward, elbows on the table.
But before that, some confusion at the courthouse.
Files disturbed. Office turned over. I'm told you were to meet him tonight.
I do regular copying for Henrico County.
I was to collect payment for last week's work. Coleman studied her.
You're more observant than most copyists, Miss Hayes.
Clerks talk. They say you linger over certain pages. Ask careful questions about certain estates. Certain children.
I read what's in front of me.
You do more than read. He paused. You have a good business here. Clients trust you. Reputation matters, especially for someone in your position.
It would be a shame if that changed. If licenses became harder to renew. If work dried up in Richmond.
The thread hung between them, plain as the lamplight.
"I've broken no law," she said.
"No. You haven't." Coleman stood. "All of Graves' papers are secured now. Courthouse records are intact. There's nothing left to investigate. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Good. You're free to go."
"And Miss Hayes, I trust we won't need another conversation."
She walked out into the March night.
The air was cold enough to burn. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from a fury so deep it felt like scripture coming alive inside her.
"Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord."
But the Lord was taking his time. They had killed him.
Made it look clean. Rifled his office before anyone could see.
Warned her to stay silent or join him in the river.
She went home. Locked the door.
Sat in darkness for hours.
She thought of her father's voice, "Keep your head down. Don't make yourself indispensable. Don't make yourself a target."
She thought of the 137 names in her hidden notebook, children described like fine horses, sold before they could speak their mother's names. She thought of William Graves, a white man who had seen the evil and could not unsee it. A father of an 8-year-old girl. A man who had risked everything to give her the ledger. And she decided, she would not stop.
But she would become invisible again. Smarter. Slower.
A shadow with a pen. For the next 6 months, she did exactly what they expected. She copied routine documents, wills, deeds, inventories with no children listed, no LS notations.
She attended services at First African Baptist, sang the hymns, nodded politely to the white congregants who sometimes visited.
She bought vegetables at the market, paid her rent on time, wore the same plain dresses.
To every eye, she was the
same quiet, reliable free woman of color who had never caused trouble. But at night, in the small hours when the city slept, she worked. She could no longer seek out records.
Could no longer ask questions. But records still came to her desk, ordinary work, ordinary estates.
When a name matched, when a description echoed the old pattern, she memorized it. Later, she wrote it down in code, initials instead of full names, numbers shifted by 3, counties disguised as Bible verses.
She watched the planters on her list. Several sold lands suddenly. Moved west, Mississippi, Texas. One family booked passage to Brazil. The language in new inventories softened. Light complexion became fair. Refined features became healthy.
The LS marks vanished like smoke. The network had not died.
It had only learned caution. In November 1851, a letter arrived from Philadelphia.
The free black family she trusted had opened the sealed copy she sent them. They had shared it carefully with members of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society.
The society was compiling a major report on the domestic slave trade. They wanted confirmation. Not names. Not places. Patterns. Scale. Methods. Georgia wrote back in the plainest, vaguest language she could manage. No specifics that could be traced.
She used scripture to veil meaning. In my labor these 3 years among the records, I have seen no fewer than 137 souls, ages 3 to 11, set apart in the manner you describe. This is but a portion, for I touch only those estates that come to probate in the counties where my hand moves the pen. The whole is surely greater.
She posted the letter through a trusted intermediary. It reached Boston. In early 1852, an abolitionist pamphlet appeared. Printed in small runs, passed hand to hand. Titled simply The Domestic Trade in Human Souls, it contained a section headed The Trade in Near White Children. It described, without naming Virginia, without naming men, how planters in the Upper South had for decades selected women of light complexion, isolated them, produced children deliberately light-skinned, raised them apart, trained them for refinement, and sold them young to southern cities where their appearance commanded premium prices.
The pamphlet used her statistic: 137 documented cases in 3 years, likely only a fraction.
Northern papers seized the story. Frederick Douglass's North Star ran excerpts. Speakers at abolition meetings quoted it. The American Anti-Slavery Society included a summary in its annual report. Petitions circulated in Congress calling for investigation of the internal trade. The South answered with fury. The Richmond Inquirer printed a front-page editorial. These vile fabrications of breeding programs are the latest calumny from Northern fanatics bent on destroying our domestic institutions. Slavery in Virginia is conducted with Christian humanity. That some of our colored population bear lighter complexions is merely the natural consequence of our mixed society, not evidence of conspiracy or sin. Other papers followed. Denials. Outrage. Threats against outside agitators. But Georgia saw the ripples. More families moved. More estates sold quietly. The careful, obsessive descriptions in inventories grew vague. The system had gone deeper underground, but it had been named. Witnessed. Written into the record of history. She kept working. Quietly. Methodically. She added new names when they appeared. She prayed over the notebook each night, names spoken like a litany of the lost. She thought of Graves, of his daughter, of the river that took him. She thought of the verse her father had loved: "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." She was walking that valley now. But she walked with a pen in one hand and fire in the other. The ledger was not yet finished. And neither was she. The years after the warning in the courthouse basement did not soften Georgia Hayes. They sharpened her. She became a ghost in her own life, visible enough to survive, invisible enough to endure. By day she copied mundane records, grocery ledgers, church tithes, blacksmith receipts. She smiled at the clerks who once watched her too closely. She paid taxes on time. She never missed Sunday service. To Richmond, she was the same quiet, free woman she had always been. By night, she continued the work no one could see. Whenever an estate inventory crossed her desk, rare now, as war clouds gathered, she read with the same precision she had always used. When the familiar language appeared, complexion fair as milk, hair light and straight, features delicate and regular, she committed the details to memory. Later, in the small hours, she translated them into code in her hidden notebook: a psalm verse for the county, a shifted numeral for the age, the child's initial double to disguise the name. Child 142 became Anna M. Child 143 became Josiah R. Each entry a small act of defiance against erasure. She maintained contact with Grace, Phyllis, and Sarah. Their meetings moved, never the same basement twice. A back pew after evening prayer. A quiet corner of the market at closing. A borrowed room above a cooper's shop. They spoke in fragments, passing warnings like contraband: which planter had taken another light-skinned girl to the special quarters, which mother had been promised better food if she cooperated, which dealer's wagon had rolled through at dawn. They could not stop the wagons. They could not break the chains. But they could name the children before they vanished. They could whisper their existence to one another. They could make sure that when the mothers wept alone in the dark, they did not weep entirely unheard. In June 1852, Grace arrived at one such meeting with eyes red-rimmed. She spoke without sitting. They took Mary's Anna last week. 6 years old. Gray. Eyes. Hair like corn silk. Mary's been walking the quarters like a woman already dead. Georgia felt the familiar cold settle in her chest. She had met Mary, late 20s, soft-spoken, already mourning 2 older children sold south. Is there anything? No. Grace's voice cracked only once. Preston sold her 2 days ago. She's likely on a coastal packet by now. But Mary asked me to tell you, write her name. Write Anna. She said, someone has to know she was real. Someone has to know she mattered. That night Georgia opened the notebook. She wrote: Anna M., age 6, gray eyes, hair light, complexion without blemish. taken June 1852 from household of Malcolm Preston, Richmond. Sold south. Mother, Mary. Remembered. Child 142. The ledger grew slowly now. War came in 1861. Richmond became the Confederate capital, streets choked with soldiers, hospitals overflowing, the air thick with smoke and fear. Civilian copying work dwindled. Georgia took what came: military supply lists, conscription rolls, letters between officers. Occasionally, an estate inventory still arrived, men dying in battle or fever left property to be settled. Even then, the pattern persisted. Fewer children. War made transport dangerous. But when they appeared, the descriptions remained meticulous, the values obscene. She wrote them all. Child 157. Child 168. Child 179, the last, a girl of 5 named Eliza, listed in the probate of a planter killed at Chancellorsville. Sold to a mobile dealer in the autumn of 1864, as Grant's army pressed closer. On April 3, 1865, Georgia stood among the crowd as Richmond burned. Flames licked the skyline. Confederate officials fled in carriages. Enslaved people walked away from their owners, some running, some walking slowly as though testing whether freedom would hold. She watched the smoke rise like a prayer too long delayed. 2 weeks later, a knock at her door. A Union officer, young, earnest, uniform still smelling of March dust. "Miss Hayes, I'm Captain Thomas Bradley, Freedmen's Bureau. We need clerks. People who know records. To register the freed, trace families torn apart. Would you help?" Georgia looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked to her bedroom, knelt beside the bed, and reached into the false bottom of her sewing basket. She lifted out the notebook, pages worn thin, spine cracked, ink faded in places, but every letter still legible. "I have names," she said quietly. 179 children. Sold between 1847 and 1864. Ages, descriptions, estates, dealers. Most went to New Orleans. Some to Charleston. I have the connections between the men who made them. It isn't everything. But it is a beginning. Bradley opened the ledger. His fingers traced the neat columns. He looked up, eyes wide. "You kept this, here? In Richmond? During the war?" "Someone had to remember," she said. "Someone had to bear witness." Over the next 2 years she worked for the Bureau, long tables covered in paper, ink-stained fingers, voices thick with hope and grief. Her ledger became the spine of an investigation into the domestic trade. Union agents in New Orleans and Charleston cross-referenced sales records, auction manifests, bills of lading. Of the 179 names, they found traces of 43. Some had been resold 3-4 times. Several died young: cholera, yellow fever, the fevers of the sugar fields. A handful escaped during the war's chaos. 8 were reunited with mothers, aunts, older siblings who had searched for years. The rest, 136, vanished into the vastness of the lower South. Names changed. Origins buried. Lives rewritten. But not forgotten. In 1867, the Freedmen's Bureau issued its report on the internal slave trade. A thick section detailed systematic breeding in the Upper South. Georgia's ledger formed its foundation. The report named 12 Virginia planters: Draper, Harrison, Winchester, and others, confirmed participants. It named Lawrence Savard and 4 allied dealers. It included sworn testimony from formerly enslaved women who described the special quarters, the better food, the deliberate unions, the wagons that came at dawn. The report estimated that similar operations across Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, and Kentucky may have produced thousands of children over decades, children whose European features made them commodities of rare value. Northern papers hailed it as unassailable truth. Southern papers called it Reconstruction lies. Lawsuits were filed against the Bureau for defamation. They were quietly withdrawn when lawyers reviewed the evidence: estate inventories, bills of sale, private letters, Georgia's meticulous ledger. The documents spoke louder than outrage.
In 1868, a Harper's Weekly journalist came to Richmond.
He sat with Georgia in a small parlor, notebook open. "Why?" he asked. "Why risk everything when you could do nothing with the information? When no one might ever see it?" Georgia thought of graves in the river, of Sheriff Coleman's quiet threat, of Anna's name written in grief, of 179 children reduced to lines of ink. Because slavery was never only about labor, she said. It was about making people invisible.
These children could have walked free if not for the mark of their mothers. They were proof of what no one wanted to admit.
So I admitted it. I wrote their names. I made a record.
So it could never be denied.
The article appeared in March 1868.
It described her work without using her full name. She was still cautious, even in freedom. It spoke of the ledger, the network, the children sold for their skin. It was reprinted widely. It entered the growing archive of slavery's truths.
Backlash followed.
Editorials in Southern papers insisted the story was fabricated, that no Christian Southerner would engage in such things.
Georgia read them and felt only a tired amusement.
She held the ledgers. She had seen the sales.
The ink did not lie. She continued with the Bureau until 1870, when funding shrank and positions vanished. She had
helped document thousands of separations, assisted in hundreds of reunions.
The Bureau's final reports called her contribution invaluable.
Afterward she returned to copying, but for black churches, schools, mutual aid societies.
The pay was smaller.
The work was safer. Virginia in the 1870s grew colder toward black voices. She moved carefully. She kept the ledgers. The original notebook stayed with her, pages yellowed, edges frayed. She added notes when news came: a child found alive in Mobile, another dead in Louisiana, a third living as white in Atlanta, heritage buried. In 1875 a woman named Catherine Freeman arrived in Richmond.
28. A seamstress from Boston.
She had read the Harper's article years earlier.
Certain details matched fragments of memory.
She sat across from Georgia in a quiet parlor.
"I remember a cabin apart," Catherine said.
Other children who looked like me.
A mother's face. Then men came. A wagon. I never saw her again. Georgia opened the ledger. Turn to 1854. There, female child, age 7, Catherine.
Pale complexion, blonde hair, green eyes.
Chesterfield County, estate of Thomas Winchester.
Sold January 1854 to M. Thompson, New Orleans.
Mother, Sarah, age 29, still on estate as of inventory.
Your mother was Sarah, Georgia said softly.
I don't know what became of her after.
But she was real. And you were hers.
Catherine wept.
For 21 years she had carried a name she could not recall.
Now she had it.
They spent the afternoon tracing what could be traced, names of others on the same plantation, possible kin, fragments of memory.
No reunion. But confirmation. A mother's name. A place. A proof of origin. Over the next 15 years, 11 more people came.
Adults who had been children in her ledger.
Relatives searching for the lost. Some found answers. More found only endings, death certificates, resale records that went cold. But even the endings mattered.
At least I know, one man said, voice thick.
At least someone remembered.
Georgia Hayes died in 1891 at 70. The Richmond Planet, black-owned, fearless, published her obituary. It spoke of her decades documenting slavery's hidden sins, of her ledgers, of her work with the Freedmen's Bureau, of the children she refused to let vanish. In her will she left the papers to the Library of Congress, notebook, clean copies, annotations, letters. They were catalogued, preserved, open to researchers. Historians now estimate the network she exposed: 12 confirmed planters, perhaps 6 more, produced between 500 and 800 children sold through the fancy trade from the 1830s to the Civil War.
Georgia's ledger names 179 of them. It remains one of the most complete first-hand records of this corner of the domestic slave trade. Most of those children are gone from history. Many died young. Some may have descendants who never knew their origins. A few may have crossed into white society, their past erased by choice or necessity. But 179 were remembered. In her careful hand, over 17 years, under threat of disappearance, Georgia Hayes wrote their names. She bore witness when the system demanded silence. She preserved what was meant to be destroyed. The ledgers still exist. Fragile pages in acid-free boxes. Neat script. Names. Ages. Counties. Dates. Each line a quiet insistence: these children were real. They mattered. What was done to them must never be denied. And somewhere, perhaps, in the hush of an archive, heaven still listens.